As the evening light fades over the distant mountains and the familiar sounds of battle grow quiet, we find ourselves at the edge of another world. Tonight, we journey not to the blood-soaked plains of Troy or the marble halls of mighty empires, but to a land where the very earth seems touched by divine hands. A place where massive stone pyramids pierce the desert sky like geometric mountains, where golden treasures sleep in tombs older than memory, and where kings were not merely rulers, but living gods who commanded the sacred waters of the greatest river on earth. This is the story of ancient Egypt, a civilization so magnificent and enduring that its monuments still inspire wonder 4,500 years after their creation. But this tale begins not with pharaohs and pyramids, not with golden masks or towering temples, but with something far simpler and more profound: the rhythm of water and the promise of black earth. Long before the first stone was cut for the Great Pyramid, before hieroglyphs decorated temple walls, before mummies rested in golden sarcophagi, there was only the Nile. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, for the rich, dark soil that remained after the annual flood. Beyond lay the Deshret, the Red Land, an endless ocean of sand that stretched to the very edges of the world. Between these two realms, in that narrow ribbon of fertility that traced the river's path through the desert, humanity would create something unprecedented, a civilization that would endure for over 3,000 years. Picture, if you will, the world as it existed 7,000 years ago. No great cities dotted the landscape. No written language preserved human thoughts for posterity. No organized kingdoms commanded the loyalty of millions. Instead, small communities of farmers and fishermen gathered along the riverbanks, learning to read the moods of the great water that brought both life and destruction with clockwork precision. They painted simple images on pottery, boats carrying the dead to the afterlife, animals both real and mythical, dancers celebrating festivals whose names are lost to time. These humble beginnings contained within them the seeds of something extraordinary. The Nile was everything to these early people. It was their calendar, marking the seasons with its rise and fall. It was their highway, carrying boats laden with goods from the highlands of Africa to the Mediterranean shore. It was their lifeline, bringing the black earth that made agriculture possible in a land that might otherwise have been nothing but barren desert. Most importantly, it was their teacher, showing them that beneath the apparent chaos of flood and drought lay a deeper order, a cosmic rhythm that connected earth to heaven, mortal time to eternal truth. In these scattered villages, something remarkable was taking shape. The people were learning not just to survive, but to thrive. They were developing techniques for working copper into tools and jewelry. They were experimenting with ways to preserve their dead, driven by a growing conviction that death was not an ending, but a transformation. They were creating art that served not merely decorative purposes, but magical ones, images that would ensure the continued prosperity of their communities and the safe passage of their loved ones to whatever realm lay beyond the western horizon. As the centuries passed, these communities began to coalesce into larger units. In the south, where the Nile ran between high cliffs and granite outcroppings, chieftains emerged who wore the white crown and ruled from the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. In the north, where the great river spread into a vast delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea, other rulers donned the red crown and held court in the bustling delta cities. Two kingdoms, two ways of understanding the world, but both children of the same sacred flow. The tension between these two realms would define Egyptian consciousness for millennia to come. Upper Egypt, the south, was more traditional, more conservative, more closely tied to the river's sources in the mysterious lands of Africa. Lower Egypt, the north, was more cosmopolitan, more open to influences from across the Mediterranean, more willing to embrace new ideas and technologies. Yet both shared fundamental beliefs about the nature of kingship, the importance of the afterlife, and the sacred duty to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. For perhaps 5 centuries, these two kingdoms existed in uneasy balance. Sometimes they traded peacefully, exchanging the gold and granite of the south for the papyrus and pottery of the north. Sometimes they warred, each seeking to extend its influence over the other. But always, they remained separate, divided not just by geography, but by different approaches to the fundamental questions of how society should be organized and how the divine will should be interpreted. Then came the king, whose name echoes through history like thunder across water. Narmer, whom the Greeks would later call Menes, the unifier. Around 3100 BCE, this southern ruler launched a campaign that would change the world forever. We see him on his victory pallet, one of humanity's earliest historical documents, carved in stone to commemorate his triumph. There is Narmer in the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down his enemies. There is Narmer in the red crown of Lower Egypt, master of both lands. The unification was not merely political, it was cosmic. For in joining the two lands, Narmer became something unprecedented in human history. A divine king, a living god who embodied the harmony of opposites. This moment, when the two crowns were joined upon a single head, marks the true beginning of Egyptian civilization as we know it. At Memphis, where the two kingdoms met at the junction of valley and delta, Narmer established his capital. Here rose a city that would endure longer than Rome, longer than Babylon, longer than any other seat of power in the ancient world. Memphis became the heart of the realm, the place where north met south, where the administrative genius of the pharaohs first took shape. With unification came an explosion of human creativity and organizational power that seems almost miraculous. Within centuries of Narmer's conquest, the Egyptians had developed one of the world's first writing systems. Hieroglyphs, sacred carvings that could capture not just practical information, but poetry, prayer, and philosophy. They created a calendar based on the flood cycle and the movement of the stars, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 sacred days, when the gods themselves were said to have been born. The early pharaohs of the first and second dynasties established the template of divine kingship that would endure for millennia. They were not merely rulers, but cosmic forces, responsible for maintaining the balance between order and chaos, civilization and wilderness, life and death. When they died, they did not simply perish. They were transformed, joining the sun, god Ra, on his eternal journey across the sky. This understanding of kingship profoundly shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. The pharaoh was Horus, the falcon god, while he lived, and became Osiris, ruler of the dead, when he died. His every action was freighted with cosmic significance. His health affected the health of the land. His righteousness ensured the proper rise of the Nile. His wisdom kept the forces of chaos from overwhelming the ordered world that civilization had created. The tombs grew larger, more elaborate, reflecting not vanity, but profound religious conviction. At Saqqara, near Memphis, royal mastabas, bench-shaped monuments of mud brick and stone, housed not just the king's body but everything he would need in the afterlife. Food, furniture, even servants who were sometimes buried alive to accompany their master into eternity. These early dynasties established the rhythms of Egyptian civilization, the annual flood that brought both renewal and anxiety, the careful recording of grain harvests and tax collections, the elaborate festivals that honored the gods and reinforced the pharaoh's sacred authority. The bureaucracy that would become legendary for its efficiency began to take shape. Scribes, trained in the complex art of hieroglyphic writing, formed the backbone of the state. They recorded everything: the height of the flood, the amount of grain in the royal storehouses, the names of officials and their duties. Egypt became perhaps the world's first truly literate civilization, where the written word carried the power of divine decree. Trade networks extended up the Nile into Nubia, bringing gold, ivory, and exotic animals to the royal court. Eastward, they reached into the Sinai Peninsula for turquoise and copper. Northward, across the Mediterranean, they established contact with the emerging civilizations of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Egypt was no isolated kingdom, but a confident power reaching out to touch the known world. The gods multiplied and organized themselves into a coherent pantheon. Ra, the sun god, supreme but distant. Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, patron of craftsmen. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. Hathor, the cow goddess of love and music. And overseeing all, the concept of Ma'at, not just a goddess, but a principle. The divine order that kept the universe functioning, that separated civilization from chaos, that made Egypt what it was. Religious festivals marked the year's passage. The Opet festival, when Amun traveled from Karnak to Luxor, would not emerge for centuries yet, but already the Egyptians understood that the gods needed to journey, to be seen, to interact with their worshippers. The Sed festival, where the pharaoh renewed his divine power, may have begun in these early centuries, a ritual death and rebirth that allowed rulers to reign for decades while remaining eternally young in cosmic terms. Art found its distinctive style early, the formal hieratic approach that would characterize Egyptian sculpture and painting for 3 millennia. Figures stood in eternal poses. Men with left foot forward, women with feet together, both facing forward while their heads turned in profile. This was not primitive technique, but sophisticated theology made visible. Egyptian art aimed not to capture a moment, but to ensure eternity. The concept of the afterlife, which would become central to Egyptian civilization, began to take its final form. Death was not ending, but transformation, not departure, but journey to a realm where the deserving could live forever in perfect happiness. The mummy, that most distinctive of all Egyptian images, emerged from these early experiments with preservation, the desperate, loving attempt to keep the body intact so that the soul might recognize it in the next world. In the royal workshops of Memphis, craftsmen perfected techniques that would endure for millennia. They learned to work gold into intricate jewelry, to carve ivory into delicate figurines, to shape stone with a precision that spoke of divine inspiration. The palette of Nama itself demonstrates this artistic mastery, every figure precisely carved, every symbol carefully placed, creating not just a record of victory, but a magical object that would ensure the king's triumph throughout eternity. The early pharaohs understood something profound about power. It must be both seen and felt, both earthly and cosmic. Jer, a king of the first dynasty, created elaborate funeral arrangements where hundreds of retainers were buried alongside him, their bodies arranged in neat rows around his tomb, like sleeping courtiers attending their master's eternal rest. These were not acts of cruelty, but expressions of cosmic order. In death, as in life, the pharaoh remained the center around which all else revolved. The Nile itself became codified, measured, predicted. Priests at Memphis began keeping careful records of the flood's height, noting which years brought prosperity and which brought famine. They discovered the river's secret rhythm, that it rose not according to the vagaries of weather, but in harmony with the stars themselves. When Sirius, the dog star, appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn, the flood would follow within days. Here was proof that heaven and earth moved in concert, that the gods themselves orchestrated the annual rebirth. Language itself became sacred. The hieroglyphs that began as simple pictograms, a bird for a bird, a house for a house, evolved into something far more sophisticated. A writing system that could capture not just objects, but ideas, sounds, abstract concepts. The scribes discovered that symbols could represent not just what they showed, but what they sounded like, and thus began the complex interplay of ideograms and phonograms that would make Egyptian writing both beautiful and bewilderingly complex. These early scribes, trained in schools attached to temples and palaces, became Egypt's memory keepers. They recorded not just the practical affairs of state, but the wisdom of the ages, instructions for proper conduct, hymns to the gods, stories of heroes and monsters. The instruction of Ptahhotep, though written later, preserves wisdom that surely echoes back to these earliest literate generations. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed. The tongue of a person is their sword, and effective speech is stronger than all fighting. In the villages along the Nile, life took on the rhythms that would persist for 3,000 years. Farmers learned to read the river's moods, to plant when the waters receded, to harvest before the next flood came. They developed the shaduf, the ingenious lever system that could lift water from the river to irrigate fields that lay beyond the flood's natural reach. They domesticated the sacred animals that would become central to religious practice. Cattle whose strength pulled the plough, cats who protected the grain stores from rats, dogs who guarded homes and accompanied hunters into the desert. The villages themselves reflected cosmic order. Houses faced north to catch the cooling breeze, their flat roofs serving as workspaces and sleeping areas during the hot months. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, as if the earth itself were a sacred diagram. Markets bustled with goods from across the known world. Cedarwood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from the mysterious lands far up the Nile, where dark-skinned people mined the metal from veins in granite hills. Religious practices multiplied and intertwined. The cow goddess Hathor, later so beloved throughout Egypt, may have emerged from these early farming communities where cattle meant survival. The falcon god Horus, patron of pharaohs, surely grew from the awe that desert people felt, watching these magnificent predators soar above the valley. Local gods, protective spirits of particular places, gradually organized themselves into a coherent pantheon as political unification demanded religious unity. The royal tombs at Abydos tell their own story of evolving beliefs. The earliest are simple pit graves, distinguished from commoners' burials mainly by their size and the richness of their grave goods. But gradually they become more elaborate, lined with wood, then brick, then stone, divided into chambers for different purposes, surrounded by subsidiary burials of servants, pets, and precious objects. Each generation of tomb builders reached a little higher, dreamed a little grander, as if sensing that their constructions were rehearsals for something magnificent yet to come. The pharaoh's regalia crystallized into symbols that would endure unchanged for millennia. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt, proclaimed his dominion over both lands. The crook and flail, borrowed from shepherds and farmers, declared him guardian of his people. The false beard, tied on with ribbons, connected him to the gods, who were always depicted as bearded. The uraeus cobra on his brow promised death to his enemies and protection to his subjects. Mystery cults began to emerge around certain deities. Osiris, the dying and resurrecting god who would become central to Egyptian religious practice, may already have had devotees in these early centuries. The myth that would later explain his death at the hands of his brother Set, his dismemberment and scattering across Egypt, and his resurrection through the love of his wife Isis, surely grew from older stories about the annual death and rebirth of vegetation, about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, fertility and sterility, life and death. Trade routes extended like arteries from the heartland. To the south, expeditions pushed up the Nile beyond the first cataract into Nubia, returning with gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals for the royal menagerie. To the northeast, caravans crossed the Sinai Peninsula to bring back turquoise from ancient mines and copper from Timna. To the north, ships sailed the Mediterranean, establishing the first contacts with the emerging civilizations of the Aegean and Anatolia. The bureaucracy that would become Egypt's most distinctive feature began to take shape. Officials with titles that would persist for millennia: Chief of the Royal Seal, Overseer of the Royal Treasury, High Priest of Ptah, established departments and procedures that brought order to an increasingly complex state. Provincial governors, responsible for tax collection and local administration, created the first version of the famous Egyptian administrative efficiency. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2700 BCE, Egyptian civilization had become recognizably itself. A unified kingdom stretching from the first cataract to the Mediterranean, ruled by divine pharaohs, sustained by the annual gift of the Nile, organized by an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, protected by the cosmic order of Ma'at. But human ambition, once awakened, knows no bounds. The pharaohs who inherited this carefully ordered world would soon discover that stone and geometry, properly combined, could touch the imperishable stars themselves. The stage was set for the most ambitious building project in human history, a monument so magnificent that it would be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But that tale of the pyramid builders, of Imhotep's genius and Khufu's vision, of the Great Pyramid rising from the Giza Plateau like a geometric mountain crafted by the gods themselves, must wait for another telling. For now, as the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, we can rest in the knowledge that the foundations of one of humanity's greatest civilizations have been laid, that from these humble beginnings along the banks of the sacred river would emerge temples and tombs, art and literature, wisdom and beauty that would inspire wonder for thousands of years to come. The great river flows on, as it has for millions of years, carrying its gift of black earth to the waiting fields. In the villages along its banks, people sleep peacefully under the protection of their god-king, secure in the knowledge that Ma'at holds chaos at bay, that the sun will rise tomorrow, as it has since the beginning of time, that they are part of something larger and more enduring than any individual life. The age of the pyramids is about to dawn, but tonight, in these early centuries of Egyptian greatness, all is preparation, all is promise, all is the deep satisfaction of a people who have found their place in the cosmic order and know that they will endure. The morning sun rises blood red over the vast waters that separate the world of men from realms unknown. In the year 1345, or perhaps 1325, for even the gods themselves disagree on such matters, a wandering tribe beholds the sign that will change everything. An eagle, magnificent and terrible, perches upon a cactus growing from what was once a human heart. In its beak writhes a serpent, ancient symbol of Earth's power. The vision burns itself into their memory like fire into bronze. Here, the god of war has spoken. Here, they will build their city. But this is no ordinary founding. These are the Mexica, the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, who have wandered for generations across the harsh landscape of what we now call Mexico. They are not the first to claim this land, nor will they be the last. Yet something in their arrival carries the weight of destiny itself. The small island in Lake Texcoco seems an unlikely place for greatness, a marshy, inhospitable spot that no one else wants. But the Mexica see what others cannot. Potential written in the very geography of the place. The lake that surrounds their chosen island will become their greatest asset, Its waters will feed the floating gardens that transform swampland into the most productive agricultural system the world has ever seen. Its channels will become highways for trade goods, flowing from every corner of their future empire. Its defensive properties will make their city nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Most importantly, its symbolic significance, water, the source of all life, will mark their capital as a sacred space blessed by the gods themselves. From this humble beginning on a muddy island, they will build Tenochtitlan. The name itself carries power, place of the stone cactus, commemorating forever the divine vision that led them here. But names, like cities, can grow beyond their origins. Within 2 centuries, Tenochtitlan will house nearly 300,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Its pyramids will rival mountains in their magnificence. Its markets will overflow with goods from territories spanning half a continent. Its very existence will challenge everything Europeans think they know about civilization in the New World. The Mexica bring with them more than hope and determination. They carry the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who have learned to thrive in this landscape. They understand the rhythms of rain and drought, the cycles of planting and harvest that mean the difference between abundance and starvation. They know which plants heal and which kill, which stones make the finest blades, and which clays form the strongest vessels. Most crucially, they possess an understanding of warfare that will soon make them the most feared people in all of Mesoamerica. Yet they are not conquerors when they first arrive. They are refugees, outcasts who have been driven from place to place by more powerful neighbors. The other peoples around Lake Texcoco view them with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. These ragged newcomers seem to possess little beyond their strange religious convictions and their willingness to fight with desperate ferocity when cornered. Who could imagine that within a few generations, these same peoples will send tribute to Tenochtitlan as vassals of the mightiest empire ever created in the Americas? The transformation begins with the lake itself. The Mexica quickly discover that the marshy environment, while challenging, offers unique opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. They begin constructing chinampas, artificial islands built up from mud, vegetation, and human ingenuity. These floating gardens are marvels of agricultural engineering, capable of producing multiple crops per year in soil so rich it seems blessed by the gods themselves. Each chinampa is a rectangle of land roughly 30 meters long and 2 meters wide, separated from its neighbors by canals that allow canoes to navigate between them like streets in a city. The construction of these gardens requires tremendous communal effort and sophisticated knowledge of hydraulic engineering. The Mexica must understand water flow, soil composition, and plant biology to make their system work. They must coordinate the labor of hundreds of families and maintain the delicate balance between fresh water from springs and the slightly saline water of the lake itself. Success brings abundance beyond anything they have known before. Failure means starvation for the entire community. Under such pressure, innovation becomes not luxury, but necessity. As the chinampas multiply and expand, they create wealth that can support specialists, craftsmen who work obsidian into razor-sharp blades, artists who carve stone into objects of breathtaking beauty, priests who maintain the complex calendar that governs agricultural and religious cycles. The growing surplus also supports warriors, men whose only profession is the art of combat. These eagle and jaguar knights will become the backbone of future conquests, but for now, they serve mainly to protect the growing settlement from raiders and rivals. The religious life of early Tenochtitlan centers around Huitzilopochtli, the god who guided them to this place. But he is not alone in their pantheon. Tlaloc, the rain god, receives equal honor, for without his blessing the chinampas would wither and the city would die. The dual nature of their central temple, one pyramid supporting 2 shrines, one for each god, reflects this fundamental truth. war, and rain. Human will and natural forces must work in harmony for civilization to flourish. The early decades are marked by careful diplomacy as much as agricultural innovation. The Mexica are surrounded by more powerful neighbors who could crush them if they united in opposition. Survival requires walking a careful line between submission and independence, offering service to stronger powers while gradually building the resources necessary for eventual autonomy. They serve as mercenaries in other people's wars, gaining military experience while avoiding the full burden of leadership. They trade their agricultural surplus for tools, weapons, and luxury goods, slowly accumulating the material foundations of power. The political situation around Lake Texcoco is complex and fluid. The Tepanecs, based in Azcapotzalco, are the dominant power, ruling through a combination of military might and diplomatic cunning. Under their overlordship live dozens of smaller city-states, each jealously guarding its independence while acknowledging Tepanec supremacy. Into this world, the Mexica must fit themselves, finding allies where they can and avoiding conflicts they cannot win. It is a delicate game that requires patience, wisdom, and the occasional display of strength to maintain credibility. Marriage alliances become crucial tools of diplomacy. Mexican nobles marry into established families from other cities, creating bonds of kinship that can be called upon in times of crisis. These unions also bring new knowledge and technologies to Tenochtitlan, as foreign wives and husbands introduce different techniques of craft production, agricultural management, and religious practice. Slowly but surely, the Mexica are weaving themselves into the fabric of regional politics, no longer outsiders looking in, but players in the great game of power. The city itself grows with each passing year. Simple reed huts give way to stone houses. Dirt paths become paved streets. The central plaza expands to accommodate larger ceremonies and markets. The first version of the Great Temple rises from the island's center, a modest structure that nevertheless proclaims the Mexica's growing confidence and ambition. Each level of the temple that will later tower over the city represents not just religious devotion, but political statement. We are here to stay, and we serve gods whose power grows with our own. Trade networks begin to extend beyond the immediate vicinity of the lake. Mexican merchants, protected by warriors and blessed by priests, venture into distant territories to exchange local products for exotic goods. They bring back feathers from tropical birds, shells from distant oceans, obsidian from volcanic regions, and cacao beans that serve as both luxury consumption and currency. Each successful expedition strengthens the city's economy, while providing intelligence about potential allies and enemies in the wider world. The military traditions that will later terrorize entire civilizations are taking shape during these early years. Young men undergo rigorous training in the use of traditional weapons. The obsidian-edged club called a macuahetl that can decapitate a horse with a single blow, the atlatl spear thrower that can drive a dart through armor, the bow that can place arrows with deadly precision at surprising distances. But they also learn the psychological aspects of warfare, the war cries that can break an enemy's nerve, the ceremonial preparation that transforms ordinary men into instruments of divine will, the ritual capture of prisoners that brings honor to warriors and offerings to the gods. Religious practices become increasingly elaborate as the city's wealth allows for more spectacular ceremonies. The calendar of festivals grows longer and more complex, marking not just agricultural cycles, but military victories, diplomatic achievements, and religious revelations. The ball game, played on specially constructed courts, becomes both sporting event and religious ritual, its outcome sometimes determining matters of life and death for participants and spectators alike. Human sacrifice always present in Mesoamerican religion, begins to take on the scale and sophistication that will later shock Spanish conquistadors. As the 14th century draws to a close, Tenochtitlan has transformed from refugee camp to thriving city-state. Its population approaches 50,000 souls. Its chinampas produce food for the inhabitants and surplus for trade. Its warriors have proven themselves in numerous conflicts. Its craftsmen create goods that are prized throughout the region. Its priests maintain religious traditions that connect the community to cosmic forces. Yet this is still only the beginning of their story. The true test of Mexica power will come with the crisis that engulfs the Tepanec Empire in the early 15th century. When the old order collapses, who will rise to take its place? The various city-states around Lake Texcoco all harbour ambitions for supremacy, but which possess the combination of military might, diplomatic skill, and divine favour necessary to forge a new empire. The Mexica, from their island stronghold, watch and wait and prepare. Their moment is coming, and when it arrives, they will be ready to seize it with both hands. The young men who train in Tenochtitlan's warrior schools cannot yet imagine that they will one day march through the gates of cities 1,000 miles away. That tribute will flow to their island capital from territories stretching from sea to sea. That their emperor will be acknowledged as the most powerful ruler in all of North America. They know only that their God has brought them to this place for a purpose, that their city grows stronger with each passing year, and that their destiny remains to be written in the blood of enemies and the glory of conquest. The eagle still perches on its cactus in the hearts of the people, and the serpent in its beak still writhes with the power of the earth itself. The vision that founded their city continues to guide their actions, and the gods who blessed their beginning will demand ever greater offerings as their empire expands. From this small island in a lake, they will reach out to touch the edges of the known world. The age of the Aztec Empire is about to begin. But first, they must survive the trials that await them. The 15th century will bring challenges that will test every aspect of their civilization, their military prowess, their diplomatic cunning, their religious convictions, and their ability to forge unity from diversity. Some of these challenges they will meet with triumph, others with tragedy. All of them will shape the empire that emerges from the crucible of conquest and expansion. The foundation has been laid, the stage is set, the players have taken their positions. Now, the great drama of Aztec imperial history can begin in earnest, and the world will never be the same. In the shadowed valleys between towering mountains, where the morning mist clings to ancient stones like memories of forgotten gods, a people emerged from the high plateau who would reshape the very meaning of power. Long before the Spanish conquistadors would set foot on these shores, before European diseases would ravage populations across 2 continents, an empire arose in the Andes that would dwarf the territorial extent of Rome at its height. This is the story of how a small kingdom centered around a sacred valley would grow to command the longest empire in human history, stretching over 2,500 miles from modern-day Colombia to Chile. The origins of this remarkable civilization trace back to the mists of legend and the whispered stories passed down through generations of mountain dwellers. According to their own sacred narratives, the first Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, that sacred mirror reflecting the sky at an altitude where the air grows thin and the gods seem close enough to touch. Manco Capac, as he was known, carried with him a golden staff given by Inti, the sun god, with instructions to wander until the staff would sink completely into the earth. Only there would he establish the navel of the world, the center from which divine rule would emanate. The archaeological evidence tells a different but no less remarkable story of gradual migration and cultural synthesis. Around 1200 CE, various groups began settling in the valley of Cusco, that fertile depression nestled high in the Andes, where rivers converge and the soil proves rich enough to sustain permanent agriculture despite the challenging altitude. These early settlers were not the sophisticated empire builders they would become, but rather one of many competing ethnic groups vying for control over limited agricultural resources in a landscape that demanded innovation and cooperation for survival. The Kilki culture, as archaeologists term these early inhabitants of the Cusco region, laid the foundations upon which imperial greatness would eventually rise. They developed the terraced agriculture that would become synonymous with Andean civilization, carving stepped fields into impossibly steep mountainsides and creating microclimates that could support crops at altitudes where farming should have been impossible. They mastered the art of working with the massive stone blocks that littered the valley floor, learning to shape and fit them with a precision that would later astound Spanish chroniclers and continues to puzzle engineers today. But perhaps most importantly, these early peoples developed the social and religious concepts that would eventually justify and organize one of history's most efficient administrative states. The notion of aini, reciprocal labor obligation, meant that communities worked together on projects that benefited everyone, from building irrigation channels to constructing ceremonial centers. The concept of elu, extended kinship groups that formed the basic unit of social organization, created networks of mutual obligation and support that could be scaled up from the family level to encompass entire regions. The transformation from Highland Kingdom to continental empire began in earnest during the reign of the 9th Sapa Inca, Pachacuti, whose very name means "he who remakes the world." Ascending to power around 1438 CE, Pachacuti inherited a kingdom under siege by the powerful Chanca Confederation, a rival group that had swept down from the northwest and seemed poised to overrun Cusco itself. According to the royal chronicles preserved by Spanish chroniclers, the aging Inca Viracocha and his chosen heir had fled the capital, leaving young Pachacuti to organize the defense of the sacred city. The battle that followed would become the foundational myth of imperial expansion. Pachacuti, according to legend, received divine assistance when the very stones of the battlefield transformed into warriors to fight alongside his forces. Whether through supernatural intervention or simply superior tactics and determination, the Chanca army was not merely defeated but utterly routed, with many of their warriors choosing to join the Inca forces rather than face destruction. This victory provided both the practical foundation and ideological justification for what would follow. A systematic campaign of expansion that would continue for nearly a century. But Pachacuti's true genius lay not in military conquest alone, but in his understanding that lasting empire required more than battlefield victories. He completely reorganized the administrative structure of the state, creating the systems that would eventually govern millions of people across dozens of ethnic groups and geographic regions. The decimal system of organization that he implemented divided the population into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 households, each with appointed officials responsible for tax collection, labor mobilization, and local administration. The Mite system of labor taxation that Pachacuti formalized represented perhaps the most sophisticated approach to public works in the pre-industrial world. Rather than collecting tribute in goods or precious metals, the Inca state claimed a portion of each household's labor time, which could then be directed toward massive infrastructure projects that benefited the entire empire. Roads were built and maintained, agricultural terraces constructed, ceremonial centers erected, and administrative buildings raised through this system of collective labor that transformed individual effort into imperial grandeur. The road system that emerged from these collective efforts defied every assumption about what was possible in pre-Columbian America. The Capac Ñan, or Royal Road, eventually stretched over 25,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, Stone-paved highways crossed mountain passes at altitudes exceeding 16,000 feet, where the air is so thin that even acclimatized highlanders struggle with exertion. Suspension bridges woven from grass fibers spanned river gorges hundreds of feet deep, creating connections between regions that geography seemed determined to keep separate. These roads were not merely transportation routes, but arteries of empire that carried information, goods, and cultural influence to the furthest reaches of Inca territory. The Chasqui system of relay runners could carry messages from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,200 miles, in just 10 days through a network of rest stations, positioned at intervals that allowed each runner to sprint at maximum speed before passing the message to the next relay. This communication system was faster than anything Europe would achieve until the development of the telegraph in the 19th century. The administrative capital that Pachacuti rebuilt at Cusco reflected the cosmic order that the Inca believed should govern all human activity. The city was laid out in the shape of a puma, the sacred feline associated with earthly power, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming the head and the confluence of rivers representing the tail. The central plaza, Huacaypata, served as the ceremonial heart where the most important religious festivals took place and where representatives from throughout the empire would gather to participate in the rituals that renewed the cosmic order each year. The Temple of the Sun, Coricancha, stood as the most sacred space in the entire empire, its walls lined with sheets of gold that caught and reflected the light of Inti, the divine ancestor of the royal family. Here, the mummies of deceased emperors were maintained as if they were still living rulers, consulted on important decisions, and brought out for festivals, where they would be offered food and drink as honored guests. This practice of royal ancestor veneration created a unique form of government where the dead continued to own property and exercise influence through their living descendants and appointed caretakers. Pachacuti's son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, inherited not just a kingdom but a proven system for expansion that he would employ to extend Inca rule far beyond the traditional boundaries of highland civilization. His campaigns pushed the empire's borders north into modern-day Ecuador and south into Chile, incorporating coastal desert peoples, Amazon forest dwellers, and highland farmers into a single administrative system that respected local customs while demanding universal loyalty to the Sapa Inca. The incorporation of new territories followed a sophisticated pattern that combined military pressure with diplomatic incentives. Local leaders who submitted voluntarily were confirmed in their positions and incorporated into the imperial hierarchy, often with their sons taken to Cusco to be educated in Inca customs and serve as both students and hostages. Regions that resisted faced the full military might of professional armies equipped with bronze weapons, quilted cotton armor, and tactical discipline honed through constant campaigning. The Mitama system of population redistribution that developed during this expansion phase represented social engineering on a scale not attempted again until the modern era. Entire communities deemed unreliable were relocated to distant regions where they could be more easily supervised, while loyal populations were granted lands in newly conquered territories where they could serve as examples of proper Inca behavior and sources of local intelligence for imperial administrators. The genius of this system lay in its recognition that true control required not just military dominance, but cultural transformation. Displaced populations gradually adopted the language, customs, and religious practices of their new neighbors, while the presence of established Inca colonists provided models for successful integration into the imperial system. Within a generation or two, regions that had been foreign conquests became integral parts of the empire, their populations identifying as much with Cusco as with their original homelands. The agricultural innovations that supported this vast population were as impressive as the administrative systems that governed it. the Inca developed more varieties of potato than the rest of the world combined, with different cultivars adapted to specific altitudes, soil conditions, and climate patterns. Maize was grown at altitudes previously thought impossible through the creation of protected microclimates and specialized irrigation systems. Quinoa, that protein-rich grain now popular in health food stores worldwide, was cultivated in quantities sufficient to feed armies on campaign and sustain populations through harvest failures. The storage system that preserved and distributed these agricultural surpluses represented logistical planning of extraordinary sophistication. Kolkhas, stone warehouses with sophisticated ventilation systems, were positioned throughout the empire at strategic intervals that allowed for efficient redistribution of goods based on local needs and seasonal variations. These facilities could maintain dried foods in edible condition for years, creating a buffer against harvest failures that made famine virtually unknown within Inca territory. By the early 16th century, under the rule of Huayna Capac, the Inca Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent and administrative sophistication. From the capital at Cusco, a bureaucracy of remarkable efficiency governed somewhere between 6 and 12 million people across an area larger than the continental United States. The emperor himself was considered a divine being, the direct descendant of Inti, whose word was law, and whose person was so sacred that common people could not look directly upon him. The royal court that surrounded the Sapa Inca reflected the hierarchical complexity of a state that had grown from a single valley to encompass dozens of ethnic groups and geographic regions. Nobles from throughout the empire gathered in Cusco for ceremonies that reinforced their loyalty while displaying the wealth and diversity of imperial territory. The finest textiles, worked in patterns that indicated the status and origin of their wearers, transformed courtly gatherings into visual representations of the empire's reach and sophistication. But even as the empire reached its zenith, the seeds of crisis were already germinating in decisions made with the best of intentions. Huayna Capac's choice to establish a second capital at Quito, closer to the northern frontiers where expansion continued, created a dangerous precedent for divided authority. When he died suddenly in 1527, likely from smallpox introduced by early European contact, the succession dispute that followed would tear the empire apart just as it faced its greatest external threat. The civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa, the two primary claimants to imperial authority, raged for 5 years and devastated the administrative and military systems that had made Inca rule so effective. Brother fought against brother, with each claimant commanding loyal armies and regional administrators. The conflict consumed resources that had been carefully accumulated over generations, while creating resentments and divisions that weakened imperial unity precisely when external challenges demanded maximum cohesion. As Atahualpa's forces finally gained the upper hand in this fratricidal conflict, strange reports began reaching the imperial court. Bearded men with pale skin had appeared on the coast, riding on enormous animals and carrying weapons that could kill at great distances. They claimed to serve a powerful ruler from across the great waters and demanded audience with the Sapa Inca himself. The year was 1532, and Francisco Pizarro had arrived with 168 men to challenge an empire of millions. The confrontation that would reshape the history of two continents was about to begin. An empire that had grown from the shores of Lake Titicaca to span the length of South America, that had created administrative systems of unprecedented efficiency and agricultural innovations that fed millions, that had built roads and bridges across impossible terrain and created a communication network that connected distant provinces to the sacred center at Cusco, now faced its ultimate test. The meeting between two worlds, two ways of understanding power and divinity, two radically different approaches to organizing human society, would determine not just the fate of the Inca Empire, but the future of an entire hemisphere. But that confrontation, dramatic and decisive as it would prove to be, was still months in the future. For now, in the high valleys where the empire had been born, where ancient stones still held the wisdom of master builders, and where the wind carried the scent of terraced fields climbing toward the sky, the business of empire continued as it had for generations. The Chasqui runners still carried their messages along the royal roads. The Mitre workers still labored on projects that would benefit communities they would never see. And the mummies of dead emperors still received offerings in temples that blazed with gold in honor of the sun. The empire that would soon face its greatest trial had grown from profound understanding of how human societies could be organized for mutual benefit across vast distances and diverse populations. The administrative genius, agricultural innovation, and engineering achievements of the Inca represented one of humanity's greatest experiments in creating order and prosperity through collective effort and shared purpose. As the sun set behind the peaks that surrounded Cusco, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the walls of the sacred temples, few could have imagined that this world of carefully maintained balance and cosmic harmony would soon be swept away by forces from beyond the great waters, leaving only stones and stories to testify to what had been accomplished in these valleys, where the gods once walked among men. The sacred waterway's great flood had finally returned to its banks, leaving behind the black soil that would nourish another season of abundance. But as the waters receded in what we now call the 14th century before the Common Era, they revealed something troubling. The established order that had governed this ancient realm for over 2 millennia was beginning to crack like sun-baked clay. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom had built an empire that stretched from Nubia's golden mines to the cedar forests of Lebanon. Their armies had humbled the mightiest powers of the ancient world. Their monuments proclaimed divine authority to the very heavens themselves. Yet now, in the shadow of their greatest achievements, the seeds of transformation were already taking root. The reign of Amenhotep III had marked the golden age of this ancient civilization. For 38 years, tribute flowed into Thebes from across the known world. Diplomatic marriages bound together the great powers in an intricate web of alliance and obligation. The capital itself had become a wonder that drew visitors from every corner of the Mediterranean, its temples gleaming with gold, its palaces echoing with the languages of a dozen nations. But this very success carried within it the elements of revolutionary change. The vast wealth that poured into the royal treasury from conquered territories did more than simply enrich the ruling class. It transformed the fundamental nature of belief itself. How could traditional gods, bound to local temples and particular cities, adequately represent a pharaoh whose dominion encompassed the civilized world? How could ancient rituals, designed for the intimate scale of the Nile Valley, speak to the cosmic responsibilities of universal kingship? These questions found their most dramatic expression in the young prince who would ascend the throne as Amenhotep IV. Initially, his reign seemed to follow conventional patterns. He completed his father's building projects, maintained diplomatic relations with allied powers, and participated in the traditional religious ceremonies that had sanctified pharaonic rule for countless generations. The great temple complex at Karnak continued its ancient rhythms. The priests of Amun performed their daily rituals, and the cosmic order appeared as stable as the pyramids themselves. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, revolutionary forces were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The prince had been exposed from childhood to the cosmopolitan atmosphere of his father's court, where foreign ambassadors brought not only tribute and gifts, but ideas that challenged traditional assumptions about the nature of divinity itself. Solar worship, always important in royal ideology, began to take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of universal empire. If the pharaoh truly ruled all peoples under the sun, might not the sun itself be the only god worthy of such dominion? The transformation began subtly, almost imperceptibly. New artistic styles appeared in royal commissions, emphasizing the life-giving rays of the solar disk. Theological texts began exploring concepts of universal divine power that transcended local cult boundaries. Foreign diplomatic correspondence increasingly employed solar imagery to describe the pharaoh's international authority. These changes might have remained within the bounds of traditional religious development, representing merely another phase in the long evolution of a royal ideology. But the young pharaoh possessed a visionary temperament that could not be satisfied with gradual reform. Around the 5th year of his reign, he made a decision that would shatter 3 millennia of religious tradition. He changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. More shocking still, he proclaimed that the Aten, the solar disk, was not merely the supreme god among many, but the only true god in existence. All other deities were declared false. Their temples were to be closed, their images destroyed, their very names chiseled from monuments throughout the realm. This was not mere religious reform, but theological revolution of unprecedented scope. Never before in recorded history had a ruler attempted to impose monotheism upon an entire civilization through royal decree. The implications extended far beyond matters of cult and ceremony. The traditional priesthood, which had accumulated enormous wealth and political influence over centuries, found itself not merely displaced, but declared heretical. The administrative system, deeply intertwined with temple hierarchies, faced fundamental disruption. Local communities, whose identity centered on ancestral patron deities, confronted the systematic destruction of beliefs that had shaped their world since time immemorial. Akhenaten's revolution was not content with religious transformation alone. He abandoned Thebes, the traditional capital with its powerful priesthood of Amun, and established an entirely new city in Middle Egypt. This new capital, which he called Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, rose from virgin desert with unprecedented speed. Here, in temples open to the sky rather than shrouded in traditional mystery, the royal family worshipped the Aten in ceremonies that broke with every convention of pharaonic religious practice. The art commissioned for this new capital departed as dramatically from tradition as the theology it expressed. Gone were the formal, idealized representations that had characterized royal portraiture for millennia. Instead, Akhenaten appeared with elongated skull, feminine hips, and prominent belly, rendered in a style that emphasized humanity rather than divine perfection. Royal family scenes depicted intimate moments, the pharaoh kissing his wife, playing with his daughters, that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. This artistic revolution reflected the broader transformation of royal ideology. Where traditional pharaohs had been distant, godlike figures, Akhenaten presented himself as the loving father of his people, made human through his relationship with the universal father, the Aten. Yet for all its theological sophistication and artistic innovation, the Amarna revolution carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The systematic dismantling of traditional religious structures alienated not only the displaced priesthood, but vast segments of the population whose daily lives had been organized around ancient patterns of festival and observance. More fatally, Akhenaten's obsession with religious transformation distracted him from the practical business of imperial administration. The diplomatic correspondence discovered at Amarna reveals an empire in crisis as provincial governors pleaded for military assistance that never came. In Syria and Palestine, local rulers who had been loyal vassals for generations found themselves abandoned to face rising threats from Hittite expansion and nomadic raids. Their desperate letters to Akhenaten paint a picture of systematic imperial collapse. "The king, my lord, should know that ever since the archers returned to Egypt, Aziru has been taking the king's land for himself. Send archers so that the king's land does not get lost." But the pharaoh's attention remained fixed on theological matters, while the empire his fathers had built with blood and bronze crumbled away. The military consequences of this neglect extended beyond the loss of tribute and prestige. The imperial system had been more than a source of wealth. It had been a demonstration of divine favor that legitimized pharaonic rule. When subject peoples successfully rebelled against Egyptian authority, they called into question not merely the pharaoh's political competence, but his cosmic role as maintainer of universal order. The very theology that justified monotheistic revolution, the pharaoh as sole earthly representative of the universal God, was undermined by his apparent inability to maintain the earthly dominion that evidenced divine approval. Meanwhile, within Egypt itself, the economic disruption caused by religious revolution created hardships that traditional royal ideology could not explain. Temple estates that had employed thousands of workers were abandoned. Craft industries that had depended on religious commissions collapsed. Trade networks that had connected Egypt to the wider world contracted as diplomatic relationships deteriorated. The prosperity that had made the new kingdom the envy of the ancient world gave way to uncertainty and want. Perhaps most dangerously, the military establishment that had created and sustained the empire began to question the pharaoh's leadership. Professional soldiers who had spent their careers expanding Egyptian dominion watched helplessly as territories won through their sacrifice were lost through royal neglect. The officer corps, drawn largely from traditional noble families, found their own religious beliefs under attack, while their professional competence was ignored in favor of theological speculation. As Akhenaten's reign progressed, opposition crystallized around several key figures who would ultimately orchestrate the counter-revolution. Horemheb, the general who commanded what remained of the imperial army, maintained order in the military ranks while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with royal authority. I, a court official who may have been the pharaoh's father-in-law, preserved administrative continuity while positioning himself to influence whatever succession might emerge. Most importantly, there were members of the royal family itself who understood that the dynasty's survival required abandoning the very revolution that had defined it. The end came with characteristic drama when Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, possibly in his 17th regnal year. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious, whether from natural causes, assassination, or the accumulated stress of governing an empire in crisis. What is certain is that his passing created an immediate succession crisis that the revolutionary government was ill-equipped to handle. The systematic destruction of traditional political networks had left the regime dependent entirely on the pharaoh's personal charisma and theological vision. Without him, the entire revolutionary structure began to collapse with stunning rapidity. The succession initially fell to a shadowy figure known as Smenkhkare, who may have been Akhenaten's brother or even his eldest daughter, masquerading as a male ruler. This reign lasted only months before another transition brought to the throne a boy who would become the most famous pharaoh in history, though for reasons his contemporary supporters could never have anticipated. Tutankhaten, as he was initially known, was probably no more than 9 years old when he assumed power, making him a perfect figurehead for the restoration that powerful court factions had already begun planning. The counter-revolution unfolded with systematic thoroughness that matched the original religious revolution in scope and exceeded it in effectiveness. The boy pharaoh's name was changed from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, to to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amun,